Certified divorce coach. I am the empowering coach who for 30 years has guided thousands of women on their divorce journey before, during, and after. My goal with this show is to bring you topics that will help you along your journey, prevent you from making the major mistakes, and to help reduce your fear of the unknown. So, without further ado, let's get started. With 50% of first marriages, 67% of second marriages, and 75% of third marriages failing in divorce, a prenuptial or postnuptial agreement can help you go through divorce and after without regret. With my guest today, Bonnie Morjan, we'll talk about these agreements and how important they are. Hi, Bonnie. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Hi, and thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Can you tell our listeners a bit about yourself and your firm?
Absolutely. So, my name is Bonnie Morjan. My firm is BMJ Law, and our goal is to guide and support changing families through divorce and other conflict to get them to a better place. We want to get you and your family through the divorce action with as little pain as possible. And I'm going to be honest, there's generally some pain when two households separate.
Absolutely.
But,
Absolutely.
you know,
Absolutely. You think about that divorce is the death of a marriage, it has the same stages of grief and pain that the death of a loved one would have. Um, Now, attorneys serve certain areas, geographical areas. Where are you located and what area are you that you help clients?
oh, I'm in New York City, so I handle most of New York City, Nassau, and Suffolk. Um, but when I answer the questions today, I'll answer them in broad terms so they're applicable to everyone that's listening.
Perfect. So, the obvious question is why would anyone want to enter a prenuptial agreement?
So usually I think of people entering into prenuptial agreements for protection, security, and clarity. There's the laws, they're not always so clear. You can talk to an attorney and they're saying the court might do this, they might do that. When you have the prenuptial agreement, you're going to get some clarity. There's also, when the laws are clear, the fact pattern or what the people did with their money may not be so clear. And if they anticipate what they're doing, because this is advanced planning, then they can plan accordingly as to, well, we know we might do this, we might do that, and they can provide for it in the agreement. You'll see this a lot when somebody knows they're going to inherit a lot of money and they want to do investments with it, and they want to make sure that money's protected, even if their spouse might be helping them manage that money or make decisions with it. Oh,
Does this also help when someone brings assets to the marriage?
correct. So the prenuptial agreement can apply to assets that the parties already have when they get married, but it's a forward-looking document so that it's going to cover what happens to the assets coming into the marriage. One of the most important provisions in an agreement, if you ask me, is what happens to the income of the marriage. If the money's coming in, then everything generated from that money is marital property. But if the income is not coming into the marital pot or the economic partnership, then everything generated from that money isn't to be shared necessarily. Depends on what the parties put in their agreement.
How important is it for people to either have separate accounts or track what is marital property, what is property that comes before the marriage, and what comes from inheritance? Do you recommend things like separate bank accounts or whatever?
I'm always going to recommend somebody have their emergency stash of cash. You never know what's
Okay.
going to happen. But that's separate from prenuptial agreements. In terms of prenuptial agreements, you do want a paper trail. You have your contract, it tells you what the rules are. You need to apply the rules. And in order to apply the rules properly, you need to know what's what. Like if you're dividing retirement accounts and you're dividing them as of the date of the marriage, you better have a statement from the date of the marriage. If you have additional money coming in, you better be able to show the money coming in, where it went, and what happened to it afterwards. If you're trying to say this money is not going to be shared money, like the
Mhm.
paper trail is the clues as to what happened with the money and what should happen with the money.
Got you. Is a prenuptial agreement flexible or can be broken? I know most people have followed the Kevin Costner divorce and the issue where the wife's trying to get the prenuptial agreement voided so she can have a different settlement. How firm is a prenuptial agreement?
They're pretty firm. Nothing's bulletproof.
Okay.
They're right. They're voided on fraud, duress, unconscionability, and unconscionable at the time you go to enter into the agreement. So, you have a 30-year marriage where one party has everything, the other party has nothing, and they've waived everything. I don't see the court upholding that agreement because it would be unconscionable at that time. It may not have been unconscionable at the time they entered into the agreement. But
what would constitute the other two reasons? I think you said fraud and something else.
Duress. So somebody was forced to sign the agreement would be duress. That one we don't see overturned too often. You will see it overturned, or the court's likely to grant that one when somebody hands the agreement to their spouse the day before the wedding and says, sign it or we're not getting married.
Mm-hmm.
And then with fraud, when somebody lies in the agreement. And typically
about how much they have
or don't have.
Oh, okay.
I would think that would go both ways, but fraud is somebody you get married or sign this contract based on a set of facts that don't exist.
How many approximately percentages do you think of divorces had prenuptial agreements? And I know this is going to cause you to wildly speculate, but is it common?
It's more common with second and third marriages, or where parents know their children are going to inherit, and they actually want the children to have the prenuptial agreement. I've seen quite a few of those. I couldn't give you a statistic. I don't have too many that come back with the prenuptial agreements, but if the prenuptial agreement did what it was supposed to, they might not be going through a divorce lawyer that litigates. They might be going to mediation, going, here's our agreement, help us resolve it, let's draw off the papers and be done with it.
I hear so many people that I see that go through divorce and have common situations like their emotions wildly took over in the divorce, or they threw their hands up and said, I give up. I don't want to deal with this conflict. You take everything. And they say 2 or 3 years later, I so wish I'd handled things differently. And so they have all this regret. Does the prenuptial agreement prevent them from that kind of regret?
Usually.
Okay.
In the prenuptial agreement, everybody's happy, but I always approach it as it's a business transaction. In fact, I joke all the time, it's my job to rain on the parade. I'm sorry. But I want them to go into it as a business transaction with a clear head, and their emotion is focused on the happy, not I just need to get out of this marriage. So they're coming from totally different places.
What do you think are some of the reasons that people avoid prenuptial agreements?
The money conversation. It's a hard conversation to have. It's certainly not romantic, but considering how many marriages fall apart based on financial stress, even if you don't sign a prenuptial agreement or enter into one, you need to have that money conversation.
I think, too, that money conversation is also so important in the marriage, where it can prevent financial abuse and other forms of not knowing where you stand financially. Would you say that?
It can. I also want to backtrack. I think prenuptial agreements are so hard to enter into because not only are they not romantic, but it makes people have an adult civil conversation about adult things. And I will tell you on the back end, what I see a lot is people cannot have this conversation.
Interesting. I hear people say things like, I think a prenuptial agreement is going to make us more susceptible to divorce. It's saying we think we're going to get divorced, so we're planning. What do you hear people say that? What do you think about that?
It's not something I typically hear. If they're saying that, they're probably not coming to me to have the prenuptial agreement done.
True.
But I think the prenuptial agreement leads to a healthier marriage because you're long-term planning with your future spouse as to what's going to happen with your money, with your savings, with, you know, whether there's going to be alimony. At this point, I ask my clients all the time, are you planning on children? And they have an answer. Even if the answer is maybe, they've had the conversation. So people to come to me to have prenuptial agreements prepared have had important conversations with their spouse as to what they anticipate is going to happen in their marriage, which I think is a indicator and necessary for the health of a long-term marriage.
Gotcha. What are some of the things that people would include in a prenuptial agreement?
So prenuptial agreements address mainly money issues. We
Okay.
avoid anything about the kids because it's too premature to say anything about the kids. Maybe we'll set some minimum guidelines. Like maybe we anticipate them going to private school. But otherwise than that, we kind of shy away from that. Division of assets and debts, if anything happens to the marriage, is the biggest topic we address in a prenuptial agreement. After that would be alimony or maintenance.
Okay. But it has nothing to do with how finances are handled in the divorce. It's all, in the marriage, it's all for after the divorce, correct?
Depends on the type of the agreement. I generally explain to people they come in two major varieties. During the marriage, are we sharing the income stream or are we not sharing the income stream? And if they're not sharing the income stream, my next conversation is, how are your bills getting paid? So in those cases, they absolutely need to have that conversation. But even in the other situation where it is a shared income stream, they should still have that conversation because you want to see ugly. See two people that are spenders get divorced, or a spender and a saver where the saver has to share everything they have with the spender, and the spender, they're going to blow it all anyway. So either way, you have to have the conversation. But if they are not sharing assets going forward, I absolutely want to make sure they have that conversation. Because when they sit down and have dinner together at a restaurant, who's paying?
Mm-hmm.
Shared income stream, it doesn't matter. Separate income stream, it matters. And I do want these marriages to last.
Absolutely. My husband and I have one, but we both had multiple marriages. And I think what it's done is give us more confidence long term, particularly when your children are grown and you have to think about if you don't have something like that, what's going to happen to all of the children involved financially.
That goes back to that long-term planning. So, and all marriages end in death or divorce. I shouldn't say all, there are a few annulments out there. But there's what happens if there's the divorce, which everyone thinks about, but there's also what happens if in death. And if there are children from a prior marriage, you do not want your spouse's children to get everything you had intended for your own children. So those agreements are critical. There's default estate rules, and you want to rewrite those default estate rules to make sure your children get what you want your children to get.
Perfect. Yeah. So we've talked a good bit about prenuptial agreements. What are postnuptial agreements?
So postnuptial agreements, almost the same thing, except they happen after the marriage. They're a lot less common, though, because prenuptial agreement has an inherent deadline. You're going to sign that document by the time you get married, or it's not getting signed. Postnuptial agreements, half of them that start with me never finish. There's no urgency to get it done. It's a voluntary document. Two mature people have to have the conversation, negotiate it, and sign it. So I don't see it happen too often. They also need consideration because in one of these agreements, you're giving up rights usually, and it's not fair if only one person's giving up rights, which makes it a one-sided contract, which then brings up enforceability requirements. And then the other person just may not sign it ever.
Are these as ironclad as prenuptial?
I don't think so, mainly because of the consideration component of it. I generally see these when there's money coming into the marriage, which means one person's trying to protect something and the other person's giving up rights. They got to get something out of it.
What would be some of the reasons that someone wants a postnuptial agreement?
So generally a substantial change in their life that the prenuptial agreement may not work for them anymore. Maybe they planned on not having children. All of a sudden they're having children. Somebody might have come into a large sum of money, or their marriage is on the rocks and they're saying, I'm going to stay married to you for a bit longer. We'll give it a trial run, but I want to work out the financials now in case it doesn't work out. Generally, those are the reasons we see for a postnuptial agreement.
Interesting. So, what would you say are the kind of things that would be covered in a postnuptial agreement?
Depending on whether you're looking to use it short-term or long-term, you're always going to, let me say not always. I mean, you can pick and choose what elements you want in a postnuptial agreement, but generally I would expect to see maintenance or alimony in there, the division of assets and debts. If anything happens to the marriage, who might be responsible for paying legal fees. You might, although not likely, see terms in there about child support. I wouldn't really expect to see anything in there, though, about custody, because if you're talking about a postnuptial agreement, you're expecting the parties to still be living in the same household, so the access issues don't come up. But if the parties are doing a postnuptial agreement and they're addressing financials, they might want to address as to who's paying what for the child.
So does a postnuptial replace a prenuptial?
It can.
Or is it in addition?
So anytime you do another agreement, you're going to have to make that determination when you do the other agreement as to what it's doing. You can have that agreement completely overwrite the prior agreement, or you can say, we're going to modify these terms. We're going to keep everything in the original agreement, change these particular terms, and then don't forget my favorite provision. What if there's a conflict? The new agreement controls, because that's the one agreement you just worked on. So it's really up to the parties. These are contracts between parties. Because there's contracts, there's rules they have to follow. These are not the back of the napkin type contracts you can do. There's very particular rules, but it requires a conversation, and you truly are negotiating a contract with your spouse.
Are the same reasons you talked about that might void a prenuptial the same reasons that may void a postnuptial?
Yes.
So it could be fraud or duress. So somebody could be pressuring somebody into it.
Right. Or unconscionability, meaning there's just no way we're going to allow this agreement to continue. These agreements are also voided on public policy, meaning that there's just something so inherently wrong with this agreement, we're not going to enforce it.
Interesting. Now, who makes that decision?
The courts.
Okay. So somebody would have to contest it for that to happen?
Correct. Just like any other contract, the court never hears about it unless somebody brings it to the court's attention and says, I need this. I either need to be released from my obligation according to this contract, or I need this contract enforced.
Gotcha. So you talked a little bit about having the discussion about finances, talk about planning. How important is estate planning in this whole process of pre- and postnuptial agreements?
I'd say very important. Every agreement I've done, there's a section on there as to what happens if the marriage ends in death.
Okay.
Some of the agreements just say we're going to avoid this provision entirely unless somebody files for a divorce action, at which point we're then going to act as if the other predeceased us. If there's a divorce action pending, and then there's the other situation where they want to protect their assets to give the assets to somebody else. New York has what's called a right of election. I'm sure other states have other provisions that state you cannot completely disinherit your spouse, no matter well, there's always exceptions to the rule. No, if you want to have that provision negated so you can leave everything to your children, you got to have them waive that right of election. There's also some other rights in there, but right of election is the biggest one. Another big one in there is the right to act as the executor. Default rules usually state the spouse can act as the executor administrator of the estate. Sorry, executor if there's a will, administrator if there's no will. And if you have an agreement that states my spouse is not going to act as my administrator, then you better appoint somebody as administrator. Like these agreements rewrite rules. If you're going to rewrite the rules, make sure you do a thorough job and replace the rules that you're rewriting so you're not leaving it up to the court to try and figure it out, which just leads to fights and legal fees, which everyone was trying to avoid to begin with the prenuptial agreement.
Okay. Is it fairly typical that you would have rules like if we stayed married X amount of time, these rules apply, and if we stayed married those amount of time, the other rules will apply?
I have the terms of my agreement. I call them AB provisions. If A, then this happens. If B, that happens. What you'll also see is like a sunset provision, meaning if we stay married for 10 years, then this happens. So these documents can be flexible. You just have to plan for the future and contingencies, which is also what makes them difficult. You're planning for the future, and nobody has a crystal ball.
When people come to you, are they fairly cordial and civil, or do you see people, once they come to you, arguing about the conversation they've had previously?
I generally see cordial and civil.
Okay.
When I talk to people, I want to make sure they're cordial and civil. It's a business transaction. You're going to enter it into a transaction. Business transaction. I don't want it emotional. And I usually ask them, can you discuss terms with your spouse before we even start drafting? Like, I have bullet points, really simple questions I'm asking people to set them up for that conversation. And the more you have that conversation with your spouse, the more they're on the same page. They feed me the terms and we do the agreement. And there's less to negotiate because they've already done some of the negotiating. But I have other people that come to me and saying, I have no idea. And I'm like, just fill out my form. We'll take it from there. And I see everything, but generally they're cordial because everybody's happy they're about to get married.
What might be some of those points or those bullet points that you ask them to have talked about before?
So, biggest one is the income stream. Is this going to be shared or not shared? We're going to assume that anything you have when you get married is going to be yours if anything happens to your marriage. But a lot of those assets increase in value during the marriage. What happens to that increase in growth? Retirement accounts are a biggie.
Right.
People act like retirement accounts are not a shared asset, even though technically they are. And it's not one of those things where you can go open a new account and say, all right, this is my premarital portion, this is my postmarital portion, because they're contributed to by an employer and you have no control except, what investment you want to put your money into. So you can't separate these out. So what happens if you get divorced with your retirement account? Are we just keeping out the premarital portion without the growth? Are we bringing in the growth? I want this conversation now, not when we're fighting over, and we don't even know what we're fighting over at this point because the stock market went down. You're not fighting over anything.
Right.
Maintenance, how long and how much? New York has a formula. A lot of other states have formulas. Do you use the formula? Do you use your own formula? Do you each say, we're not using a formula, we're just not going to do maintenance? I always ask, though, if there's going to be children, we got to plan your financial situation if there's going to be children. I don't care how you slice it or how much equality you believe in. Women have children. They carry the baby. They give birth. They're going to miss work, and they're not going to go back to the workforce the same as before they had the baby. Gotcha. I have this conversation with women all the time. They're working a job and a second job for extra cash, and they got a nice little portfolio going on. I'm like, you can't do this after you have a baby. And they're asking me why not? When are you going to spend time with your baby? If you're working a full-time job and a second-time job, you're working 10, 12 hours a day. That's not going to happen when you have a child. So, these are the kinds of questions I have people go through. Going back to, if you're not sharing income, if you're sitting at the table and you're having dinner with your spouse, who's paying for it?
Mm-hmm.
So we look into the future as to what do you plan on doing with your money? Not just if you're going to get divorced, but I also have the question as to what if you're also, say your marriage is good, are you setting yourselves up for financial success? So
Gotcha.
you should always have the money conversation. Just always.
Absolutely.
Long-term planning is important. I can't stress enough, Social Security income is not meant to be a retirement account. And people who do cash under the books or cash off the work off the books, they never seem to squirrel money away for a rainy day.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, side topics here.
Absolutely.
But
absolutely,
I'll even talk with them as to, if you are marrying somebody who's self-employed, how honest are they with their income?
Mm-hmm.
It's really easy for somebody self-employed to leave money in the business by failing to take distributions or withdraw the money from the account, and they spend the money on personal expenses right out of their business account.
Mm-hmm.
So, a lot of conversations about money and what you plan on what might happen.
What can a prenup or a post-nup do to prevent financial abuse?
Unfortunately, very little, because the person who's going to be subject to financial abuse isn't going to negotiate rights in their agreement.
Okay.
And even if you have the agreement, they'd have to enforce the terms of the agreement. So I'd love to say that these agreements would help protect people against financial abuse, but I just don't see the abused people actually enforcing any rights they have.
Gotcha. You mentioned, we talked a little bit about estate planning, which gets into things like wills and trusts. How important is long-term financial planning if you enter into an agreement?
It's going to go back to whether or not you have shared assets or whether or not you're keeping everything separate. If you have everything shared, you still want to have that conversation. Spouse, are we going to have enough money to retire? And if you're going to get a divorce at some point, you're going to be able to share that retirement account. And hopefully that retirement account will be enough to help both people. But if you're doing everything separate, which is what I see a lot of times people do, I'll keep mine, you keep yours, and one person has savings and retirement account and the other one doesn't, I'm like telling the person that doesn't, you better start saving. If anything happens to your marriage, you've got nothing.
Right.
Again, it's all financial planning. It's part of it has to do with the prenuptial agreement, but a lot of it has to do with financial planning, period, which is what the prenuptial agreement is doing. It's financial planning of what you're going to do with your stuff if you get a divorce.
Right. Of your clients that are pursuing divorce, do most of them have prenups or not?
Most of them do not.
Okay. Do you think that causes a more tense divorce?
It can.
Okay.
Generally the person who has nothing wants whatever the other person has. There's the law. It's not crystal clear. There's lots of exceptions to it. And then there's the burden of proof. And I saw a question pop up earlier about, what if you don't have the original agreement? Can you still enforce it in the court system? And it comes to the question of proof. If you can prove that that's the agreement and these are the terms and everything is in order, then the court's going to enforce that agreement. If the court suspects it's not a good copy of the agreement, maybe it's been modified, then they're not going to enforce it. It's a burden of proof as to proving that's a good copy of the agreement. Especially in the digital age, I do see the court much more lenient with copies versus original documents.
Gotcha. because the documents have to be filed with the court, right?
No.
So is there, no, they don't.
No,
Okay.
prenuptial agreements, they do not have to be filed with the court. Now, every prenuptial agreement I've ever said or I've ever read said if we're getting a divorce action, we're submitting this document to the court for the judge to issue a ruling consistent with the terms of the agreement.
Gotcha.
And matrimonial law is mostly contract law in terms of you have your prenuptials and your postnuptial agreements. But when people are getting divorced, they're negotiating usually a settlement agreement. And when they can't reach the terms of the settlement agreement on their own, that's where the court's coming into play saying, either we're going to figure out the terms for you, but we're going to strongly encourage you to resolve this with some guidance of ours. So it's all about contracts for the most part.
Gotcha. You mentioned matrimonial law. Is matrimonial law different than family law, than divorce law?
So matrimonial law is divorce law. Family law is something different. Matrimonial law has 5 major issues as far as I'm concerned. There's custody, child support, maintenance, division of assets and debts, and who's going to pay the legal fees. In family law, you're dealing with subsets of those, or like one of those issues. Family law, you go to family court over a custody issue. You're going to go in front of a referee. If you're going to go into family court, which is family law about child support, you're going in front of a magistrate, at least in New York. With a divorce case or a matrimonial, all of these issues go in front of the same judge. I've had one judge describe matrimonial law as a symphony because there's so many moving parts to it.
Gotcha. You mentioned something in those, the difference in matrimonial law. Oh, I know. The question about who pays legal fees. What's the thought behind who pays legal fees?
At least New York has the presumption that the more moneyed spouse is going to help pay legal fees for the less moneyed spouse. They don't want the person with the deep pockets burying the person in litigation who doesn't have assets to pay for a lawyer. There's no hard and strict rule on this. I've seen the courts do everything from here's a couple thousand to you see orders for $100,000 plus of legal fees.
Wow.
There's really no clarity on it though, because even when the courts do those decisions, they don't give you enough details about the case that you could figure out why they issued those that ruling or that amount. You'll get little tidbits, but really not, they might say somebody was particularly litigious, but they won't tell you what they did that was particularly litigious. And these are not, matrimonial and family court cases are not sealed, but they're restricted, meaning the only people who can access these files are the attorneys to the case and the litigants and the judges.
Mm-hmm.
So, if I'm representing somebody on a matrimonial case and they have a family court case, I'm not their attorney. I can't go pull their family court case. I'm not the attorney on that file, even though I'm representing them.
So when would somebody have a matrimonial case and a family law case? I thought the matrimonial was more an umbrella.
It is. Sometimes people start at piecemeal in family court.
Okay.
Like people could say dad moves out and leaves mom with the kid. Mom can go to family court for an order of custody and an order of support. Or she could even just go for an order of support. She doesn't have to go to the Supreme Court to get straight for the divorce judgment.
Does there tend to be a different judge on matrimonial than family law?
In New York, there definitely is because of the high volume. In other places you go, you're going to find judges filling multiple roles. Where you can find your criminal judge might be your matrimonial judge, might be your family court judge. Just in New York City in particular, we have specialized judges because there's just so many people here.
Gotcha. So I always like to ask my guests, what 3 tips would you give someone about pre- and postnuptial agreements?
All right. Going back to the money conversation, the thing I like about prenuptial and postnuptial agreements is it makes people talk about money and long-term planning. So I always want people to have that conversation, particularly if you're having that agreement. Even if you're not, I'm going to tell you, have that conversation. It makes sense and it's good for your marriage. The agreements are a binding contract. Negotiate it like a binding contract. I know everybody's happy. They're going to get married. Everybody's on cloud 9. It's still a business transaction, and you need to treat it like a business transaction. I've seen all too often people don't want to hire an attorney to read the agreement. They're like, I'll sign whatever. It's like, no, don't do that, because you will be bound by that agreement. And then keep a paper trail of your documents. It doesn't have to be a physical paper trail. Keep a digital one. But if you want to prove that an asset is yours and you don't have to share it, you need to show the court the paper trail to show or to document your point. Like, I'm a huge fan of Judge Judy. Everybody who talks to me knows this. And Judge Judy all day long is doing a he said, she said. You make Judge Judy's day when you walk in with the paper that says, here, this is what I said, here it is in writing. Like, so you want to have that paper trail. It just makes everybody's job so much easier. And people remember things differently, sometimes on purpose. So the paper trail will, paints the story, and you don't have to rely as much on memory. And when I have to do my cases with or without the prenuptial agreement, if I have to prove separate property credits, I need the paper trail. The other person is not obligated to take you at face value. You have to prove it.
Gotcha. Bonnie, thank you so much for being my guest today. This has been incredibly educational. I learned so much, and I'm sure the audience did too, but thank you for being with me.
Thank you for having me, and I appreciate the opportunity to educate everyone as to why prenuptial agreements are valuable. And even if you don't have one, you still need to have that money conversation and do your long-term planning. Thank you.
Absolutely. And thank you to my listeners for being with us today. With the right support, guidance, and information, you can move through the divorce process with the right amount of knowledge, skills, and confidence. I help you understand and navigate the process, come to terms with your emotions, avoid costly mistakes, find your true voice, and be empowered. Most women have spent a lifetime investing in others while neglecting themselves. Divorce isn't a time to do this. Work with a certified divorce coach, because these decisions, just like the ones Bonnie mentioned with pre- and postnuptial agreements, will last you for a lifetime. And make sure you do the planning before you even talk to your spouse. If you're interested in learning more, schedule a free consultation with me at herempowereddivorce.com. Thank you so much for staying with us. Until next time, take care and stay empowered.